I want to go to your article here, the Taiwan fixation, because there was four big points in here I see that you made that I want to get you to expand on a little bit. Number one is you say that Taiwan is of low strategic imperative for the United States. Now that seems to go against what a lot of people think publicly. Why do you hold that position?
Well, I mean, the reasons that people think that Taiwan is strategically important to the United States, number one, its military value, especially the concern that if China were to take over Taiwan, they would be able to use the island either as sort of like an aircraft carrier and put missiles on the island, allow them to fire further, and hold U.S. Bases along the second island chain or elsewhere in the region at risk. There's a concern that they might base their submarines on the eastern side of Taiwan. Right on the eastern side of Taiwan, there's a big drop-off underwater. So submarines in that area can quickly sort of disappear into the depths. There's concern that if China were, right now, China's submarines are quite noisy and easy to track because you can catch them when they're in the Taiwan Strait and when they're trying to exit the Taiwan Strait. Where it's shallow, sort of easier to find them. The concern is that once they are on the eastern side, if they can base there, it will be very hard to track them. So they could disappear into in underwater and, approach the U.S. Without the U.S. knowing until it's kind of, much further on in the game. So that's another concern. I see these as sort of small benefits. I don't think that being able to base submarines on the eastern side benefits China like all that much. And in any case, eventually Chinese submarines are going to be quiet enough, just like U.S. submarines, to sort of disappear wherever they want. So eventually we're going to lose that benefit anyway. Building a missile arsenal and base on Taiwan would take years, not something they're going to have quickly. Would give plenty of time to kind of compensate. So I don't see the island as having the same sort of military value. I mentioned before, I don't see the economic value as being all that high. It's obviously important, but not irreplaceable. It's also not clear to me that the semiconductor fabs last through a war. So people say, like, we have to defend Taiwan because of the semiconductors. Okay, so you fight over Taiwan, you really think the semiconductor manufacturing facilities are going to survive?
Yeah.
They're not. They're going to be blown up by the U.S. or by China. So, like, I don't see that them surviving. So to me, if there's a war over Taiwan, the semiconductors are gone anyway.
That's a great point. Yeah.
It's also true that, this capability would not fall into Chinese hands if China were to seize the island and the semiconductors fabs survived, because most of the production relies on Western intellectual property, which isn't stored on Taiwan. It's stored elsewhere and could be cut off. So you have the ability to limit that. In any case, China's probably going to have the capability to build the most advanced semiconductors on its own pretty soon. Again, you're kind of diminishing value here.
Yeah.
The third argument people make is about U.S. alliances, that if Taiwan falls, all partners in the region will doubt U.S. credibility and will bandwagon with China. But if you talk to people in the region, that's not what they're going to do. They're not going to watch China take over Taiwan and then decide to form an alliance with China. They're going to be concerned for their own security. They're going to invest more in their own defense. They're going to potentially move in closer to the United States or balance together amongst themselves to protect themselves. So I just don't see Taiwan as having the strategic importance that people say it does. It's not going to shift the balance of power in the region were China to control it. So I think it makes a lot more sense for the United States to think about its interests elsewhere in the region and invest in those. It certainly doesn't make sense to take on the cost of a war with China over Taiwan. It's just not existential to the United States. And if the U.S. is going to fight a war with China, the issue at the core of that war should better be existential to U.S. security and prosperity.
And this is not. You've kind of touched already on the second point there of what else could Taiwan do for its own defense. So I'll move on to the number three, which is, you says the best U.S. strategy is to balance China's power. What does that mean in practical terms, to balance China's power?
So right now, the U.S. approach to China is more one of dominance. It wants to be the dominant power in Asia. It's getting increasingly difficult as China gets more and more military capabilities and its economy grows. So balancing Chinese power just makes sure, it's just this idea that the United States wants to make sure that it is at least a co-equal power with China in the region. And what that requires is that countries like Japan and South Korea are not controlled by China, because that's where the real industrial power in Asia is. India too, right? As long as those countries are either U.S. partners or independently, like not aligned outside of China's orbit, then the United States can maintain a balance of power with China in the region. And that doesn't require any sort of U.S. control or U.S. defense of Taiwan. It's independent of Taiwan. So it's a much less escalatory strategy, much easier for the United States to attain militarily, and much less provocative to China, because you can do it mainly by investing a little bit more in Japan, and investing more along the second island chain in Asia, which is things like Guam and the Mariana Islands and Micronesia.
And doesn't risk sinking two aircraft carriers. So there's that bonus too.
Yeah.
Number four, you said that we should prioritize U.S. interests. What does that mean to prioritize U.S. interests? And if you could talk militarily, diplomatically, and politically, and economically, how do we actively, in terms of actual policies, prioritize American interests?
Right. So, I mean, first, prioritizing U.S. interests. By that I mean making sure that no matter what happens to Taiwan, U.S. interests are protected. So economically, top priority is access to markets. In order to protect that, you need to make sure the United States can access at least the Philippine Sea. Philippine Sea is big. It would be very difficult for China to control. So that's actually quite easy. If the United States invests in some of its bases in Japan, builds up Japanese military capabilities, or helps Japan build its military capabilities, and invests in its infrastructure along the second island chain. Submarines can play a big role, so that's kind of a plug for investing in the U.S. submarine industrial base. That is all that's really required economically. So the posture, military changes kind of go along with that. I think the best approach is really to pull U.S. forces back to a certain degree from the first island chain, to move them away from places like Okinawa, where they're very vulnerable, to move them away from Luzon, where they're very vulnerable, to get the trainers off of Taiwan, where they're nothing more than a tripwire. Those types of moves will not only be de-escalatory and suggest some accommodation to China. The United States does not want a war, but they also will allow the United States to invest in places where U.S. forces will be better protected. So if there were to be a conflict, they would survive that conflict, as would their planes and ships and things like that.
And I was just going to say, and just kind of in general, I mean, the one thing we haven't even touched on yet in the potential clash between the United States and China is the potential that the war could escalate into nuclear realm. What do you think of the concerns of that?
Well, obviously, any war between two nuclear powers, you have to worry about nuclear weapons. I think the biggest risk of nuclear war is a couple of things. I think first, if China really thought that it were going to lose, not fight to attrition where they could then use a blockade, but actually thought they were going to lose, they might be tempted to use nuclear weapons. But the bigger risk is if the United States starts conducting ground strikes on mainland China. That's not like official U.S. policy, and it's something that the president would have to authorize separately. But the U.S. has the capabilities to do it, and they've made that clear by deploying this Typhoon system to the Philippines, because that system can fire Tomahawk missiles, which can reach anywhere from 1,500 miles to 2,500 miles. In Luzon and elsewhere in the Philippines, they're quite close to the Chinese coast, so that would be deep inside of China. And this would allow the United States to hold at risk key command and control nodes in China, as well as to hit civilian infrastructure and potentially conduct regime decapitation strikes, which would take out Chinese leaders. Those for China would be existential threats that could cause them to escalate to nuclear war, especially because once you start hitting mainland targets, China might not be able to be sure whether the United States was aiming at conventional targets in mainland China or trying to take out China's nuclear arsenal. And if they suspected that the United States might be trying to take out their nuclear arsenal, then they would, want to use their own nuclear capabilities to prevent that. And that could mean tactical nuclear strikes on targets in the region, or worst case scenario, it could mean strategic nuclear strikes on the U.S. homeland.
Right. All of which just really, really underscores why it would be foolish to even contemplate fighting a war with China over anything in Taiwan Like you say, unless it's an existential threat to us directly, it would just almost be suicidal to even go down that road. So you've definitely painted that picture today, and we really appreciate it.